the urge to censor and punish blasphemers has been so ubiquitous throughout human history. You know, in the past 20 years, as you noted, there's been this huge clash between, radical Islam and the West on in this issue of free speech. But zooming out throughout history, depending on the time that you're talking about, the cradle of free speech or the worst offenders with regard to blasphemy and heresy have been at times Europe. At times it's been the Arab world. It's been sort of everywhere, and it's been changing, and the locus of free thought has been changing. And free speech has always sort of been the underdog for the most part. It's only been the norm in a small part of the world for a pretty small amount of time.
Yeah.
And I do think this impulse of sort of punching down and punching up being a limiting factor on free speech is, I think, probably the most potent force right now against free speech, which is this totally understandable sense that you should be using your free speech to make the world a better place. And if you are bullying the weak with it, then I have really no drive to protect your speech. But I think the part of the problem with this is that whether you're punching up or punching down depends on the resolution of your microscope, really, like how zoomed in, how zoomed out you are. So like if the picture you're looking at is Muslims in Europe, where Muslims are a minority, many have arrived recently, many don't speak the language of the country they're in. Many of these countries don't have a long history of assimilating foreigners. You can understand what the balance of power is at that level and feel that you're protecting the underdog by protecting the speech of Muslims or protecting the sort of sensibilities of Muslims in Europe. At the same time, if you look at it, the same picture at a different resolution, you can describe the situation as the world's second largest religion, practically very close to the world's largest religion, which has a minority within it of women, not a minority of women, but a minority of gays, certainly, LGBTQ people, free thinkers, atheists, who would very much benefit from the ability to criticize the Quran and criticize Islam in the same way that people in the Christian and post-Christian parts of the world are clearly benefited by the ability to criticize ideas in the Bible. So looked at that way, the logic of who's punching up and who's punching down totally inverts. And you can do that a million times over, and it's never really clear who's punching up and who's punching down.
And at the most fundamental level, when you're pointing an AK-47 at someone who's sitting with a pen drawing cartoons, the power relationship is always going to be at the level of the guy holding the AK-47.
Right.
But I totally agree with that. So there are, as you mentioned, there are a number of Muslim majority countries in the world where, unfortunately, even though, as I try to point out in the book, there's a long history of some free thought in the Arab world, and certainly one of great philosophy that helped spark important intellectual developments in the West. But currently, it's very difficult to find a Muslim majority country where free speech is on the par with, say, in Western Europe, and in particularly blasphemy laws tend to be quite strict. There are actually a number of countries where formally, at least, you can be punished with death for blasphemy or apostasy. And it's clear that in those countries, being a non-Muslim or being a Muslim with heterodox views is makes you the one with less power. But even within the West, so there are also people who are from Muslim majority countries who may be heterodox Muslims living in the West, or who are no longer Muslims, who no longer believe. And should their right to criticize religion the way they see fit be curtailed, in defense of the majority of the minority? So you'll always have these minorities within the minorities, and so that's why I think someone like Frederick Douglass was absolutely spot on when it came to free speech, because he both saw it as especially important for the oppressed, but also, basically a fundamental human right that did not depend on the color of your skin or your status, but basically on the simple basis of manhood, and there forever let it rest. And I think that to me is an unsurpassed ideal of what free speech should be like. So your rights to speech should not depend on your color or your religion or your ethnicity. Of course, context can always play into when the right to free speech does not mean that you should. This is so obvious, but it does not mean you don't have the right to criticize it, or that you should be in agreement with certain forms of speech. And context will always influence the way that we view and judge speech, and there, your whatever status you belong to might influence the way we judge it, but it shouldn't sort of decide your right or the basic tolerance given to someone to be able to speak.
I'm struck by what you said about having a culture of free speech being the most important thing, that laws often are not enough. In the face of a culture that's hostile to free speech, what's written on pieces of paper may not matter all that much. And I think this is an important point, because on paper, our First Amendment prohibits the government from infringing on my speech or on the freedom of the press. But in every other institution, what really governs the day-to-day goings on and our interactions are norms about free speech. Just this sort of intangible element of culture. So, when you're on a university campus, do people expect that I have veto power over someone that comes to speak here, over someone that's been invited to campus, right? That's a norm. Either people just understand that there's a norm of free speech, or people have this expectation that I should be able to shout down a speaker that I hate and prevent them from speaking. At a company like Spotify, for instance, there are currently calls to censor Joe Rogan's podcast over the perception that he disseminated misinformation and disinformation about COVID, and he's allowed guests on his podcast that are just saying untrue and harmful things. A lot of what happens there is going to be the result of what is the culture of employees at Spotify. What is the larger elite culture that those employees are inhabiting? And that's going to have a big effect on what ideas really enter into the culture.
Definitely.
And I was struck by in your book, you discussed the free speech culture of Athens, of ancient Athens, and how there was this distinction between sort of two types of speech, one being the formal free speech in the assembly. And that was called, I may be mispronouncing this, isagoria.
Isagoria, yeah. I'm not an expert on the pronunciation, but yes, isagoria, yeah, equality of speech.
And then on the other hand, there was this notion of sort of informal, uninhibited speech, this wider norm of the expectation that you could talk about matters of import at the market with random people. And that was, I don't know how to pronounce that either, but parrhesia, something like this.
Parrhesia, yeah.
Yeah. So, it struck me that even back then there was this understanding that there's a difference between the formal allowance legally of free speech in a political context and a wider cultural norm of free speech. And I think this is important because sometimes people will use the fact that we have a First Amendment as a reason to poo-poo concerns about free speech in the culture. So can you talk a little bit about that distinction historically and maybe today?
Yeah, sure. So I completely agree with you on. I think the Athenian origins of free speech of sort of what I see as the origins, at least, of egalitarian free speech, which has been clashing and still clashes with a more elitist free speech concept, which was more prominent in Republican Rome. American history is full of examples of Milton's curse, where specific conceptions of free speech were advanced by specific groups of people who thought it to their advantage, but who thought specific ideas were too harmful to be allowed. And you see it even with the founding generation. You see it in 1798 with the Sedition Act, adopted by the John Adams, by the Federalists to protect the John Adams administration. And you have this split between sort of Federalists like Adams, like Hamilton, and on the other hand, Madison and Jefferson, who are very critical of the Sedition Act. So, but if that generation who had fought for independence, American independence, and who had really bashed the British for their seditious libel laws that they saw as slavery, if they can then suddenly turn around and say, oh, by the way, the First Amendment does not actually allow you to poke fun of John Adams, and you should go to jail even if you're a journalist or a politician, a congressman, has happened. That should tell you something about the need for a culture of free speech to be really robust. Go to the 1990s, 1920s, where you had, people, socialist peace activists who were critical of American involvement in World War I, who were sentenced to 10 and 20 years in prison for opposing the draft and opposing American involvement in World War I. Today we'd say that's insane. That's an authoritarian state that sends politicians and peace activists in prison for opposing, for peacefully opposing their government's policies. But that was a reality of the First Amendment at the time, which didn't really mean that much. So obviously the culture of free speech needed to change in order for the First Amendment to really be given the full meaning that it has today. And I think one of the beautiful things about that is that the civil rights movement played such an important role in expanding the protection of the First Amendment by winning a number of sort of landmark cases from the late 50s and into the 60s. And I think that is a very good example of why I think sort of this progressive liberal tendency to sort of say, free speech is now being weaponized against minorities and democracies is a very, very dangerous tendency.